Well, good evening, and welcome to FitGreyStrong's live webinar on aging, health, and exercise. Look, my name's Sean Wilson. I'm an exercise scientist. I have an intense passion about how lifestyle can modify the trajectory of how we age. So, look, I suppose the objective of tonight's webinar is to try and give some bit more clarity around why resistance training is so important for older adults, and also to put in context that I think at the core of public health initiatives to improve the outcomes in older adults in terms of health and well-being, that one of the things that should be at the core of those public health initiatives is the promotion and advocacy of resistance training to improve the way older people are able to get around and function and, enjoy life as much as possible. So look, we've got a fair bit to get through. I'll share across the slide deck. There's a couple of housekeeping things that I need to go through. So just give me a moment while I share the screen across for you. So, look, tonight the views, I'll read this out, the views and opinions expressed during this webinar are mine alone, presented by FitGreyStrong, and should not be construed as advice or guidance in any way. We would suggest that if you are seeking to make any exercise changes to your lifestyle or to implement any of the research findings or training ideas presented herein, that you seek professional assistance and coaching from an appropriately qualified and experienced expert. There's a wide range of viewers, so I've attempted to make the content of this webinar understandable for all. And any questions that you would like to ask, please submit those via @FitGreyStrong on Twitter or Facebook, or if you have a YouTube channel, you can submit questions there also. So look, the overview, the broad overview of tonight is to, I suppose, postulate that what lies at the core of good health, quality of life, and functionality is good strength. And it's something like if we look at some of the data in the next, say, 40 odd years, there's going to be approximately 2 billion people aged over 60 by the year 2050. So that's a very rapid change in demographics in terms of people over 60 that will require all sorts of different services and interventions to help them to live as well as they can. Now, one of the obvious things that happens as we age is that there's an attrition in skeletal muscle mass and also strength, and this is associated quite very closely with functional deterioration. So again, one of the goals of tonight is to look at, can that trajectory be altered? There you can see a lady here lifting quite a bit of weight. We've got to ask the question, what exactly is strength? Like, how do we define it? So I think to put that into context for tonight's presentation, the definition that I would like to put forward, and this is coming from exercise science. Look, strength is a neuromuscular ability. It's about generating maximal voluntary contractile force, and this force is transferred through the skeleton, through the bony structures. And there's always, as part of the definition of strength, it's about overcoming the most resistance that person can overcome in one effort. To just go back and just provide a little bit more context in terms of how can we perhaps look back into the past to give us insights present day. And this is trying to look at ancestrally, what we did before we sort of lived in this advanced civilization that we live in now. And some researchers back about, it was about 7 years ago, O'Keefe and some other researchers proposed that many of the health ailments that currently beleague us in terms of chronic disease and some of the challenges that lay ahead can in part, or largely in part, be attributed to these very, very sedentary lifestyles that we now live. Not all of us, mind you, but a large proportion of the population does not get a lot of not a lot of physical activity. And this over time plays out, and we'll explore this a little bit further, how these low levels of activity can almost accelerate these aging processes and lead to perhaps things like poorer health outcomes and premature mortality. These researchers here, what they suggested was that if we went back to these ancestrally based activities and looked at some modern equivalents, you can see here that some of these things, hunting, stalking animals, like all of these things we used to do many, many years ago, and the carrying of the heavy objects, the lugging prey, and the resistance training sort of is a modern equivalent of those particular activities. So if we look at say the resistance training, we have to give a definition. What is it? Some people would not really understand what that means. Resistance means that there's some sort of load, some sort of weight, some sort of band, some sort of body weight. And the critical thing is that it utilizes forceful muscular contractions, and it's designed to either increase strength, power, and/or muscular endurance. The concepts around resistance training are very broad, it can be complex as well, but essentially what you're trying to do is provide a little bit more than the muscle is able to cope with. And I don't mean, ridiculously out of control, but it's about challenging the ability of that muscle to be able to recruit and overcome more resistance than it has done before. And what tends to happen is that there's an adaptation process that goes on where you get stronger. Now I want to move on to a couple of key questions in terms of tonight's presentation and get these out up front. Two key questions we need to ask is, does strength improve quality of life, QOL? And can strength protect us from disease, disability, and premature death? There's some good data around these questions now. And if we look at, say, some of the work that's been done around the quality of life stuff, you can see that, that in terms of very recent study published that explored 9 months of resistance training in older adults and wanted to ascertain whether quality of life, sense of coherence, and some of these, does depressive symptoms, are they ameliorated a little bit? And the interesting thing to come out of this study was that there was two key things that sort of did improve here. We look at some of the results here. You can see that resistance training, and not having a lot of time to go into depth with the methodology, but they had a control arm and a resistance training once a week, twice a week, and 3 times a week. And this is where the separation in terms of some of those differences occurred. Now, sense of coherence was a new term to me, and I looked that up in the paper, and it's explained as a life orientation and reflects an individual's perception of how meaningful, manageable, and comprehensible their life is. Environmental quality of life reflects how satisfied individuals are with their environment and with their access to different services. Now, the interesting thing they found with this study, that there seemed to be what you would call a sweet spot or a Goldilocks dose where it was just right. 1 was not really very effective, 3 was probably going overboard, and 2 tended to get this statistically significant difference in these particular qualities. So there was a suggestion that maybe there is a ceiling level in terms of how much we should be prescribing in terms of the resistance training loads, in terms of frequency, which I'll touch on a bit later on. if I can pronounce this, Krasniewski, a couple of years ago, looked at a 15-year follow-up period in older adults and found that resistance training was associated with significantly decreased all-cause mortality. So the older adults who were concordant to the current recommendations of 2 sessions per week showed it was about a 46% reduction, which is quite impressive. The other thing that there's been some work done, this is a figure taken from McLeod 2016, and it was adapted from Ruse 2008. And it looks at the question as to whether does muscular strength have any relationship to all-cause mortality and cancer mortality. And the interesting thing you can see is that when you look at those under 60, and remember to try and explain this, the lower third obviously are those that are weaker than the upper third. You can see that the reduction, it's almost twice the reduction in terms of some of these incidences of mortality. So what that suggests is that skeletal muscle strength is associated with healthy aging. And in this particular work that Ruse did, it was about double in terms of all-cause and cancer-related mortality. Looking at it from another angle, this is associational, obviously. This is looking at mobility as a predictor of all-cause mortality. And the interesting thing about this study was they looked again at the, those who aren't familiar with the TUG test, nice name, the timed up and go test. It's a very simple test. It involves sitting on a seat, approximately 33 to 40 centimeters. It varies depending on the methodology. And the goal of the test is to sit in this seat. You've got a cone or a marker about 2.4 odd meters to 3 meters away from the person. The person elevates themselves off the seat. They head to the marker away from the seat as quickly as possible, go around it, go back down and sit on the chair. Now, the fascinating thing about this study was that mobility, the times that these older adults performed on this particular simple test correlated to and predicted their chance of dying. So there's this very close association between physical capacity or strength, fitness, and the chances of, and this is all cause, remember, so it's from anything. So the chances of dying of anything were significantly reduced in those that could perform this test a lot quicker. So let's move on. Let's move on to some of the age-related skeletal muscle changes that do occur. Have a look at some of these scans and so on. So here we have, again, a bit of work taken from McLeod. You can see, like, this is no surprise probably to those that are watching. This is a muscle cross-sectional area reduction. So you can see at around age 20 compared to, say, 80, that muscle size is decreasing drastically. And this is directly age-related. The thing is, though, that from around 45-ish, around here, there's a rapid acceleration, which a lot of that is not just aging. A lot of it we now think is closely connected to what we do when we wake up, what do we do when we're awake, and obviously there's a nutritional aspect which I won't touch on tonight, but certainly from around the 40 to 65, there's a lot of work we can do to have people in better functional states later on in life. In terms of where this particular decrease is coming from, it appears to be, like, the evidence is fairly strong, that's preferentially coming from these type 2 muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers, just think of those muscle fibers in your body that enable you to run quickly, jump very high, or lift heavy objects. And this is the thing, you can see if you look at any 50-year-old person, you don't see too many doing those particular activities, and that ties into this lifestyle sort of induced decrease. If we look at these scans here, C, D, and E, you can see, well, there's some very, very stark differences between the 24-year-old male and the Ds and Es. But have a look at the difference between, your rectus femoris, lateralis, like some of these quadricep muscles and even the hamstring leg flexor muscles. And the difference being, you can see that there's a great deal. Apologies, I've just had a message come through. I'll turn that phone over. Continuing on, the difference being that there's a great deal of number of steps in the person that's scanned from D versus a much higher daily step ratio. And resistance training has an even sort of more potent effect on what this looks like. "50 micrometers is about 0.05 of a mil. A is your younger adult, B is your older adult. This is a sort of a staining of and biopsies of muscle where they pull out tissue and stain it to see which fibers are what. You can see the difference here between like slide A and slide B, that there's a very, very significant reduction and almost clustering as well. So this is where this major atrophy is occurring in these type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers. However, it should be said that it's not just about muscle mass. There's more to this process of decreasing function than just the loss of strength. And you hear these terms in the lymphopenia and so. Look, essentially dynapenia from the Greek word dynamis, meaning power, and penia meaning the poverty of. So this is sort of the poverty of power. And sarco from the Greek word sarx, so the loss of flesh, so to speak. So this this loss of flesh versus loss of strength. And it was Manny and Clark graphically illustrated this when they compared some of the work in the Health ABC study. And what this showed was that the loss of strength occurred at a much more rapid rate than the loss of muscle mass. You can see the differences in the two lines. The thing to bear in mind with this particular data is that the more accurate our methods are of ascertaining this muscle mass, you tend to see that this relationship, and you can see the arrows just pointing up, it shifts this curve or line closer to muscle mass, but it's never exact. There's always a disproportionately greater loss of muscle strength versus the loss of muscle mass. So just bear that in mind. What that's hinting at is that there's neurological, like maybe central nervous system and neurological changes that also occur with aging. So here's the question that I posed earlier, that I postulated could alter this trajectory. Can resistive exercise, can resistance training alter the trajectory of aging by preserving skeletal muscle morphology and function? Almost 60 years ago, Perkins and Kaiser, this is going back, and they showed that older adults in just 6 weeks, over 60 years of age, were able to increase their quadricep, and that's this thigh muscle, this anterior thigh muscle, upper limb, by 60% in a very short period of time. So our understanding of the changes that can occur through this type of training are quite well known. A seminal piece of research was done by Picard in 1990, and this particular trial, this was a very, very interesting trial because it was, whilst it was cross-sectional, and what that means is it recruited older, and the average ages were sort of around 68 to 70 years of age. And what they did was they went and grabbed a bunch of swimmers who'd swum for the last 12 to 17 years, a bunch of runners for about the same time that had been runners for that period of time, up to that 68 to 70-year age group. They had a control group, so a sedentary older control group. They had a younger group as well. And they had a strength or resistance trained group. And what they wanted to do was compare, were there differences in muscle structure and function? What were the activities that they were doing for a longitudinal period of time? What effect was that having on muscle structure and function? And this is, I've extracted this particular part of a sort of a strength related, and you can see here elbow flexion, which is the movement. It's like doing a bicep curl. A knee extension, like doing a leg extension or extending at the knee. And you can see the different groups, the young controls, old controls, swimmers, runners, and the old strength trained. And I suppose the fascinating thing to come out of this study was that when they looked at the structure and the function of each of these groups in each of the muscles and tested them in a variety of ways, the muscle function and structure of these older strength trained participants was almost indistinguishable compared to this younger age group. So this was some of the early work that suggested, well, is the aging that's going on, is it purely just aging per se, or are there other things that are factored in that are contributing to, you know, the status of that person when they're sort of 60, 65, 70 and beyond. Again, another seminal piece of work by, look, I have problems pronouncing this, Fiatoro, 1990. And again, these are very early works into this sort of space. And this was a really, really interesting study. You can see in terms of, I'll go through the results first. There was a small group of patients, but there was quite a significant increase in strength and mobility. And the participants in this trial were at a nursing home. They were the oldest of the old. There were 86 years of age. They had these orthopedic problems. They were on a number of medications. And these are probably the toughest in terms of seeing robust outcomes from exercise training. But the findings are quite conclusive. Skeletal muscle at any age is responsive to exercise training, providing it's progressive and providing it's intense enough. So the average strength increase in this trial was about 170 odd percent. And some of them, you can see some of them had some, you can see some were a little bit less responsive, but some of the ones that really responded were getting close to 400% improvements in strength. That perhaps even more compelling in terms of what this data suggests is that some of I think there was 2 participants in this trial that were able to discard their walking canes after 8 weeks of training. So initially they had walking canes, and after 8 weeks they were able to walk unassisted. They then did a detraining period, and a lot of the strength that was developed was subsequently lost. Well, moving on, looking at here we have again a scan of, now this is a very, very interesting study too, and it was designed to explore the neuromuscular changes in, again, older adults that had significant disuse and underwent a hip replacement operation. And this was the control leg, so this is their good leg, so pre and post. And this is the operated leg, and this served as a control. This was the leg that was trained. So they performed what's known as unilateral training. That's just a fancy way of saying single leg training. So once the operation was successfully completed, there was 3 different groups. The ones that were doing strength training, there was another group that had electrical stimulation daily for 1 hour, and there was another group that underwent standard sort of physical therapy 3 times a week. Now, the results of this trial, you can see, I suppose a picture paints 1,000 words, but you can see that I've listed out some of the different muscle groups here, and you can see that there's quite a dramatic difference in this, the vastus lateralis, one of the thigh muscles, the rectus femoris. You can see there's significant changes there, and these sort of medialis muscles have had good growth as well. Look, even the hamstrings have increased in size as well. The changes in the muscle tissue scans also translated into some very, very robust changes in strength and rate of force development. So the training was very, very specific, that once they had gone through sort of like a pre-training period, that there was this focused effort on very rapid movement on the concentric, which is that sort of pushing up phase. Excuse me. Now, again, Neilwick 2013 shows where, what's happening, what muscle's actually undergoing these adaptations, like where's most of the change occurring. On the left of this slide, this is young versus elderly. So statistically, in this particular trial, the stark differences again are in these fast twitch type fibers. Post-training, on this side, the A and B on this side, pre and post, that's looking just at the older adults, what was happening in terms of the quadriceps, the cross-sectional area, and also the muscle fiber size. And you can see that most, if like the authors here concluded that all of the changes were primarily in the type 2 muscle fibers. There's other research to show, depending on the training stimulus, that you'll also see changes in type 1 as well. So I've posed this question, but have we really learnt anything new over the last 30 to 40 years? What's changed from, say, 1990 to now? There's been that much research in this space. You could read it for your whole life. So here we go. So this is looking at the etiology of age-associated loss of strength, or dynapenia. You can see there's a lot of nervous or neural inputs to dynapenia, as well as a lot of muscular inputs. All of these things have been researched. There's work out there that have looked at things like, peripheral input changes, spinal all of these things input to lead to dynapenia. Now, the interesting thing is that even knowing all of these different particular parts of the picture, does it really change what we have at our disposal to improve this, to decrease the likelihood that you're going to lose strength, become more at a greater risk of falling? And the answer to that is that, well, pretty much we know what type of exercise improves this quality. I feel the need for speed. Okay, so yeah, Top Gunner pulled that out. One of the things that is making, I think, a more consolidated sort of perspective on what can really affect good functional outcomes, and that's how the exercises are performed. Are they performed slowly, or are they performed with high velocity? And this is quite a recent piece of work that looked at different types of low velocity resistance training versus a high velocity. So obviously with your low velocity, the load is quite heavy. With your high velocity type movements, the load is reduced, but the velocity is increased. And what you do see is some very, very significant differences between these two types of training. And in this particular study, even affecting how well older adults were able to perform on, say, a short physical performance battery of tests, which is a number of different things. So if we look at some top line results in this particular trial, you can see this is the LVRT, so the low velocity, and you got average power here, and this is the velocity. This is how quick the movements were completed at. And this is the high velocity. And you can see that at the 180 to 240, that there was some very, very significant changes across the study. And I think what is particularly relevant with this particular trial is that if you measure, say, angular velocity of someone doing as quickly as they can, and this is 60 and over, a sit to stand. So that's sitting from a chair, standing up, and you measure things like the angular velocity or angular degrees of movement at the hip and knee. You're going to be somewhere between 140 to 220 degrees per second. So this type of high velocity resistance training is speculated to be more functionally relevant to ADLs, to activities of daily living, because we don't do that many things at a slow speed of movement. So some very significant differences there. And very, very recently, Candor published this commentary, which is titled "Explosive Type Contractions should not be avoided during resistance training in the elderly." There's a number of points that I thought was relevant for tonight to list. So why should explosive resistance training why should we prescribe that to older adults? Well, at this stage, there's not really any compelling evidence that resistance training performed to MF. Now, MMF is short for momentary muscular fatigue. Now, what that means is if I do an exercise and I have a certain amount of load or weight, and I keep doing that till I just can no longer execute any more repetitions, any more work, that's defined as that point of fatigue, that momentary point of fatigue. But at this stage, there's no evidence to show that going to that point versus prior to that point, whether it be 1, 2, 3, or 4 reps before failure, there's no additional benefits in terms of neuromuscular adaptations in older adults. Multiple sets, particularly high reps, again performed to that point, are significantly more stressful hemodynamically. So there's definite correlations between that and blood pressure. So should we be doing that? Should we be doing MMA, that sort of training in older adults those that do have high blood pressure? That's a question for trainers to look into a bit more. In terms of what's most important to this population, that the function supersedes hypertrophy. We're looking at improving function rather than looking like Arnie. And the most effective strategies to maximize power to lean body mass, that muscle tissue that you carry around, should be encouraged. In terms of the capacity for healthy and frail older adults to carry out their activities that they carry out during the day, the capacity is strongly associated with muscle power output and rate of force development. So it's definitely more closely tied to how much power is being pushed out and that rate, rather than just a pure strength where there's no time component. In this population, power declines more rapidly than strength. And like I said earlier, there's a growing body of evidence to show that explosive resistance training is more effective at improving function than just slower, more traditional resistance training. And there's some good work showing that it can be carried out both safely and effectively, even in the oldest of the old. I asked this, I mentioned this earlier in the webinar, and I asked the question, is there a sort of a Goldilocks dose? Like how many times a week, like how many sets? Like they're all questions that have been researched here and there. And this is a particularly important question, because if you do too much and provide too much load to older adults, you are going to get greater inflammation, greater inflammatory gene expression in muscle. Is that a good thing? Or it's probably not. So this is an important question, and I think the best study that I've seen that has investigated or explored this this optimal dose in older adults is this trial by Steck. It's very recent, and it looked at 4 different types of training approaches. Very, very good study. Lots to get out of it. And I'll explain a little bit about the study. So it compared 4 different prescriptions. Now, HL, HH, Triple H, and HLH were the different arms. The H stands for high load. So think of your slower movements, your traditional strength training where the load's quite heavy and the velocity is low. Now, the L stands for training that is low in resistance, but very, very rapid in movement. So that first group, the HL, did one session of heavy slow strength training and one session of light, very rapid training. The double H was 2 heavies in the week. The triple H was 3 sessions in the week of heavy load strength training. And the final one, the one with the 2 H's and the L, they did 2 heavy sessions and 1 very low in terms of load, but very rapid movement. So it varied in intensity, frequency, and contraction type. It was about 35 weeks in length and 60 to 75-year-old older adults. The primary outcome was gains in thigh muscle mass. So that was what they were looking at. A few comments on that, and the secondary was muscle function. I would have liked to have seen this as the primary, because there's a little bit tighter in terms of when you make a primary outcome. That's the thing you're really trying to investigate. And I think whilst gains in thigh muscle mass is an important component, I think that's a secondary. I think muscle function in this age group is absolutely key. So I would have, the researchers are doing the research. I would have actually suggested to change them around. And some of the exercises you'd be familiar with: squat, knee extension, leg press. So they did a number of different exercises, and they were standard right across, and they were all machine-based, which is another important point to make. A lot of the research does confine itself to machines, and I think that could be because easier to assess, easier to learn, not as complex as some of the free weights. Whether that's the best thing to do, I would suggest that we need to be more progressive and include more difficult free weight type movements. They used a DEXA, which is this dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, and that's a fancy X-ray machine which can determine how much body fat you have, how much muscle you have. They looked at the bilateral legs, so they added both legs, how much muscle mass, thigh muscle mass, and arm muscle mass as well. They looked at a number of different other parameters: strength, power, muscular endurance, mobility, function, flexibility. They looked at these at regular intervals. They did muscle biopsies, gene expressions that were indicative of inflammation, and these anabolic signaling as well. They supplemented training with some whey protein, and the daily protein intake was approximately 1 gram per kilo per day. Now, looking at some of the results, this is looking at the total body lean mass change. So not the primary, but it's looking at what occurred in each group in terms of that total body lean mass change, the muscle mass change. And what they did find was that this wasn't all that effective as a group. Importantly, to point that out, as a total group, these were not bad, but the group that had a significantly greater increase, and it was close to twice the increase in this lean mass, was this group that did the 2 heavies and the 1 low, very quick session per week. Now, when you look at these results individually, it gets quite interesting, because what you have, here's the groups again up here listed across the top, and this is looking at bilateral thigh muscle mass change. And you can see they've classified n equals 5, n equals 33, and n equals 25, so numbers of these participants. And there was some extreme responders and some normal responders and poor responders. And you can see that the consistency that this group here, the high, low, high, consistently had the most robust changes. But that being said, there was this variation that came in where this group, where it was concluded it wasn't all that effective, did have some that responded very robustly here. So it's one of those things where we can make conclusions from the research, but it doesn't always fit that n equals 1 person, because you might have someone that only needs 2 sessions a week that gets quite robust responses. And the question then would be asked, well, if you had them put them into this group, would they have been even further? And they're questions that are very difficult to answer. Now, within this study, they looked at the effect of these training prescriptions, these resistance training prescriptions, on cardiorespiratory responses. Now, this is looking at walking. This is looking at walking at 3 miles per hour or 4.8 kilometers per hour, and then looking at what sort of consumption is required to continue at that steady state pace. And you can, pre and post, that should be the other way around, sorry about that. But you can see here that for this group here that had these most effective changes, you can see that it's gone from about 15.4 down to 14.2. Now, that was the only group that showed an increase in metabolic efficiency, which just means that when you're walking at this 4.8 kilometer per hour pace, that you're able to do it with less stress on this system. It's easier to do. So that ties into this notion of that makes things during our those activities of daily living that you often hear at the ADLs become easier for those that can make these sorts of improvements. So the summary of the findings of this trial: the improvements were impressive for all groups, but not the HL. And remember that I did say, however, some in this group had very impressive improvements. The 2 heavies and the 1 fast session were the only group that had these reductions within group reductions in this walking. And you can see VO2 and heart rate over the length of the trial. Again, this group produced the greatest gains in total lean mass and thigh muscle mass. Interestingly enough, the 3 heavies gained the most arm muscle mass. So does that suggest that the upper body might need more frequent stimulation to optimize that muscle mass growth? That hasn't been answered adequately yet, I don't think. And yeah, whilst I said earlier, while substantial individual heterogeneity in muscle mass was observed, that group with the 2 heavies and the 1 explosive light session had the most consistent and highest responder rates. Interestingly, I don't know whether you noticed in that previous graph where it looked at the individual results, some participants actually showed decreases in bilateral thigh muscle mass, most coming from that the the one heavy session and the quick power session group. It's a difficult one to explain because remember, these are participants that are unfamiliar with this sort of training. So at the very least, I would have thought that it would have maintained the muscle mass that was there, but to actually see a decrease, I'm not sure whether that's because of the accuracy of the methodological protocols used, or whether there was perhaps whether they were consuming a diet, they were in a hypoenergetic state and then lost muscle tissue that way. The data suggested that no one was consuming less total calories than they were taking in. So yeah, that's a difficult one to explain. Again, this group was the only group that increased that one-legged knee extension maximal strength. And 7's quite an interesting point. The 3 sessions per week and those 3 stimulatory lower limb training sessions cause this pro-inflammatory muscle gene expression in the quadricep, that vastus lateralis where they took the biopsies from. That's probably, you want to try and avoid that. So if you remember back to the very early, that quality of life and sense of coherence study, that also showed that 2 heavy sessions per week was superior to 3 for that environmental quality of life and that sense of coherence. So there's a bit of consolidating around, okay, how many sessions per week is optimal. So getting towards wrapping this up, here we're looking here at FitGreyStrong's FIT guidelines. So this frequency, intensity, time, type guidelines for resistance training in older adults, and I've split these into that sedentary, novice, chronic disease area and the intermediate, advanced, healthy in terms of the older adults, because I think that's quite a distinguishing point. Is we need to make that quite clear. Frequency, like I said before, I think 2 sessions minimum. 3, I'm reluctant to recommend 3 heavy sessions per week. I think starting with 2 here and potentially adding in a 3rd, but a high velocity power, and we'll look at this in progression. In terms of intermediate, advanced, healthy, I still think the 2 per week is adequate. 3 heavy to absolute fatigue, I just think that's perhaps pushing it. It would only be for a select few, and I think you'd want to keep a close eye on some of those outcomes in terms of, are we inducing inflammation, etc. In terms of intensity, a little bit different between this group and this group. To start, this 1 repetition maximum is, what can I lift once? So looking at around 50 to 65%. This is sort of a rating of perceived exertion. On a scale, you're looking at 0, and I'll show you this in a minute on another slide. So it's looking at the lifter or the person doing the training, their perception of how much effort they are subjectively exerting. And this is used quite well in cardiovascular or aerobic training as well. Technique development, absolutely critical in this beginning and this stage here. And going to absolute fatigue, not required. I would even limit the sets to absolute fatigue as well, even in this group. I think that a lot of the gains of strength, the neurological gains, are made prior to that point of fatigue. So this is where I'm talking about non-failure training versus failure. Again, RPEs quite a lot higher. The rep range is very wide, primarily sort of that 4 to 8. But there's some good evidence now to show that if you are doing higher reps, if you're getting closer towards that fatigue point, you still get good strength and muscle growth changes. In terms of length of the session, 20 to 45 minutes, depending on where they're at, 30 to 60 for these trainees. Keep it a little bit simple in terms of type, machine weights, resistance bands, body weights, compound type movements. So things like, things like that work more than one joint. These more intermediate advanced lifters, compound multi-single joint and functional exercises, all available resistance training methods. Volume, an important component of the picture. Lower number of exercises versus those a bit more advanced. And when I talk about this total work sets per session, work sets are those sets that are classified as not a warm-up set. So you're not going to start an exercise on a heavy weight straight away. You may have one or two warm-up sets that prepare you for the more difficult work. And quality versus quantity, I'm a big believer in quality training versus high volume training in this age group. Progression, we can slowly increase this as they become more adapted to it. Minimum, I would suggest a minimum of at least 6 weeks at this lower intensity range. Free weights is indicated. So as they become more adept at the movements, start to incorporate the free weights. Look at the one high velocity power session per week. And the progress should always be based on good foundational strength. Maintenance key in these very, when you're talking advanced or healthy ones where they've been doing it for a while, this risk versus benefit of seeking continued progression. If you have someone who's 65, who's a very advanced lifter, I am reluctant to keep trying to push for further progression because there's a point at which that can be counterproductive. So it's more about, can we maintain those robust gains that have been made up to that point? Strength balanced with power training. Rest periods, you've got between sessions, which I think again is a very important parameter to look at. Some of the work has shown that you really don't get, and this is possibly can be related to younger lifters too, that this central system or systemic fatigue may take 72 hours to get full recovery. So you just got to be careful. 48 hours would be a minimum, and you get most of the muscle tissue recovery in that time. But there's a bit of a hangover effect in terms of the central mechanisms of fatigue. So you may want to extend that out a bit. And I find what works very well with older adults is that you may do a strength or resistance training one, and then have a couple of days of cardiovascular oriented training or what have you. And then after those 2 days, you can then hit the resistance training. That gives that bit more time to recover from these training sessions. In terms of inter-sets, so you do a set, how long do you rest till you do the next set? I've got 1 to 3 minutes here and 1 to 5 over for the more advanced, intermediate, healthy. These rest periods are obviously proportional to intensity, velocity, and training objectives. If you're looking at things like developing power, I would suggest a bit of a longer rest. If it's things like muscular endurance, you can tighten that rest up so you're having to load the muscle up in a shorter time frame. And intraset, some may not be familiar with that. That's where you do a repetition and do you have a rest or do you do the set continuously? There's some good work to show that if you throw in some intraset rests, meaning I do a repetition, I have a 1, 2, 3, 4 second rest and go again, that strength improvements can be enhanced even further because you're able to jack up that volume a little bit more. And tempo or velocity, eccentric, these numbers here, the first number relates to the eccentric. Now, eccentric is if I was standing up and I went to sit on a chair, that lowering part, that's the eccentric. The 0 would be no rest on the chair. The 1 would be the raising up from the chair, and the 0 would be when I'm standing up. So there's ways that you can change tempo. Like this is probably a parameter that often doesn't get varied enough to stimulate these adaptations in occur. You might be wondering what the star means. The star just means to move as rapidly as possible. So you can see that it would be a 3-second descent, no pause, up as rapidly as possible, pause for a second, then go back down for 3. So these are some of the things that can be included in programs to squeeze out a little bit more benefit. And I mentioned this there, I'm just going to touch on this very quickly, the Omni Resistance Exercise Scale. So this is where you use a perceived exertion in terms of the lifting to guide the person's intensity level. So 0, extremely easy, 10, absolutely as hard as you can go, and utilizing this scale to guide that intensity rather than just that percentage of 1 RM, because that can be a little bit difficult to do on the run. So nearly there. This is one of the last slides. I've put together what's a genericized, excuse me, healthy beginners older adult resistance training program, incorporating some of the fit guidelines that I presented on those earlier slides. And you see there's the exercises, sets, reps, you know, that rating of perceived exertion or that Omni scale, rest between sets, and tempo. Remember, this is very generic. You wouldn't just go and prescribe this to any factor in all these other considerations before. But this just looks at so a warm-up combination. So this is a resistance band lateral side step to hit some of those hip abductor muscles, standing march, sit to stand, and this is like a bit of a warm-up circuit reps that you would do of those, and at what intensity. SS is superset. So that superset just means you do the next exercise straight away. You can alter that a little bit and have some rest. A farmer's walk, lying on the floor to standing. So all these functional movements. And the little arrow means that the back extension is done immediately into the leg extension. These are the rep ranges for the beginners, the scale, what rest you're having between this exercise to this. So there's, you know, the lower body exercises and the upper body exercises. I didn't put any sort of bicep curls, triceps. You're getting enough activation in some of these compound movements to start with. You can include them later on the track. And again, some tempo parameters as well in terms of how these exercises are performed. So concluding remarks. So I've made a couple of notes, which let me just find my page for you. So these are remarks that I'd like to make. Like, firstly, this trajectory of how we age and the deterioration in health and functionality is something that can be altered. It can be changed if the right sort of lifestyle behaviors are incorporated from, you know, particularly from around that age 40 onwards. That decline can be attenuated, and it's quite clear in my mind that that's the case. To see improvements in strength and power, they need to be challenged. You're not going to get stronger by going for a 4-kilometer walk. That will not stimulate the types of neuromuscular changes that we want to see. Thirdly, the single most important impact for older adults in terms of worsening health, quality of life, and functionality is physical inactivity, but particularly effects of dynapenia, like this loss of strength. It really does have a major impact on those things once you get 60, 70, 80. Improving strength in older adults is a strongly liberating process, and I truly think it's a very worthwhile pursuit for all those that are older. And finally, it's improving strength in older adults is of paramount importance and should be a key priority of all public health initiatives globally. So that brings us to a close. The last slide, some of you would have seen this. The slide I saw actually at my daughter and son's choy, their martial arts they do, and I think this sums it up. What fits your busy schedule better, exercising 1 hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day? So that draws the webinar to a close. If there's any questions, as I said earlier, please submit these via your YouTube channel or via at FitGreyStrong on Twitter or Facebook. Now, just give me a moment. I'll bring the camera back up so you can see me. Stop there. All right. Thanks, guys. I'll just check if there's any questions. Doesn't look like there is. Hang on, let's go. No, nothing there. All right, let's call it a night. Thank you, everyone, for joining this live webinar, and adios. Catch you next time. See you later.